General Hospital will reveal from the moment Jocelyn was recruited by Brennan into the WSB, her life was no longer her own. Every decision, every step she took from that point on was measured not by her own will but by the invisible weight of a mission far greater than herself. It was as if she had crossed an invisible threshold into a world she never imagined she would belong to, a world of shadows, secrets, and sacrifice. Once, she had been a young woman of bold conviction, unafraid to voice her thoughts to Carly, her mother, with whom she had always shared everything. But now, that version of Jocelyn existed only in memory. In her place stood someone hardened by necessity, someone carrying the burden of truths that could never be spoken aloud. Secrets had become her armor, but also her prison. Killing Cyrus had been the first act that shifted the axis of her world. A violent necessity committed in the name of self-preservation, but it had left a mark on her soul nonetheless. It hadn't ended there. When Dex died, a different kind of grief settled in. One that no amount of justification could dilute. He had been her anchor, the one person who saw the vulnerable parts of her beneath the fire. With his absence came a hollow ache and the unnerving realization that control was an illusion. She was spiraling. So when Brennan came with his carefully measured words and half-veiled promises of purpose, Jocelyn stepped into the role like it was fate calling her name, reluctant, trembling, but resolute. She kept it all hidden. Carly, the one person who might have pulled her back, was left in the dark. And worse, Jocelyn concealed not just her new identity but also the illicit and dangerous bond forming between her and Jack, Carly's own partner. Every time she met Brennan's eyes or stood close to Jack in secret, it was like adding another blade to the slow bleed of betrayal. It was no longer just about lies, it was the erosion of everything she once held sacred. Trust. Loyalty. Family. And yet, there was no turning back. Brennan, satisfied with her performance regarding the Cyrus operation, decided it was time to test her further, not just her efficiency, but her ethics. He gave her a direct, brutal order: eliminate Vaughn. The target wasn't just a name on a file. Vaughn was a seasoned agent suspected of betrayal, but to Jocelyn, he was more than a mission. He was someone she owed her life to, someone who once shielded her when things went off script during a covert WSB recon she had barely survived. The debt she carried toward him was unspoken but deeply rooted. And now Brennan wanted her to repay it in blood. There was no mercy in Brennan's tone, no space for second-guessing. His stare was ice, and his voice was a scalpel, precise, unyielding. Either she carried out the directive, or she was out. Stripped of her new identity, branded unfit for the clandestine world she had only just begun to navigate. But he didn't know the whole story. He didn't know that carrying out his command wouldn't just compromise Jocelyn's moral compass, it would shatter what remained of her humanity. It wasn't just a mission. It was a test designed to break her. As her mind churned in conflict, another presence continued to pierce through the noise: Emma. Their relationship had started under strained circumstances, bred from competition, suspicion, and quiet resentment. But as the months passed, something deeper had grown between them. A fragile, unexpected kinship, one that transcended rivalry. It was not quite friendship, not quite sisterhood, but it carried the intensity of both. Emma had always been someone Jocelyn found difficult to read but impossible to ignore. And now, in the chaos of her new reality, Emma remained the last echo of her conscience. Emma had once vied for the position with Professor Dalton, only to be pushed aside under mysterious circumstances that she didn't fully understand. The truth was that Jocelyn had been ordered to secure that spot. It wasn't ambition that drove her, but duty. Still, it didn't make the betrayal any less bitter. Watching Emma unravel with confusion and quiet hurt had tormented her more than she let on. Jocelyn wasn't proud of what she'd done. She had justified it as collateral in a bigger game, but deep down, she knew she had crossed a line. And now, when she looked into Emma's eyes, she saw the ghost of someone she used to be staring back at her, brave, trusting, and unaware of how cruel secrets could be. She couldn't keep it buried forever. The lie festered inside her, growing heavier with each passing day. Emma deserved the truth. Not just as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had unknowingly held up a mirror to everything Jocelyn was becoming. And perhaps, by telling her, Jocelyn might reclaim a piece of the girl she had lost along the way. But timing, as always, was cruel. Just as Jocelyn debated opening up, Brennan's test loomed closer. The Vaughn mission was non-negotiable. It was an ultimatum disguised as an order, and the clock was ticking. Jocelyn had to make a choice, not just about Vaughn's life, but about her own integrity. And in doing so, she had to confront the growing awareness that her transformation might already be irreversible. She was no longer the girl who flinched at deception. She was the woman calculating consequences, weighing sacrifices, and standing at the edge of a path where each step forward came at the cost of another part of her soul. And Emma might be the last person who could pull her back from the brink. But only if Jocelyn was brave enough to let her in before it was too late. She sought out Emma on an afternoon that felt like a storm, not in the sky, but within herself. The weight pressing down on her chest was heavier than any thundercloud, and the air between them was thick with the unspoken, taut and fragile, like a violin string pulled to the point of snapping. Jocelyn had tried for weeks to contain the flood inside her, to walk the tightrope of secrets and assignments without stumbling. But she had reached the edge. The guilt had metastasized into something corrosive, something that no longer allowed her to sleep through the night. Her dreams had become jumbled reels of faces, Cyrus's lifeless stare, Vaughn's haunted eyes, and Dalton's calculating silence, all swirling into a storm that tore through her sanity piece by piece. She didn't come to Emma to beg for forgiveness. She knew that the damage had already been done and that apologies were the currency of cowards when spoken too late. What Jocelyn offered wasn't a plea, it was the truth. Raw, fragmented, and heavy with consequence. She spoke as if peeling away layers of her own flesh, as though each confession cut closer to bone. Her voice, when it broke the silence, was not desperate but solemn, shaped by the weight of betrayal and the agony of self-awareness. She spoke of Brennan, of how he had come into her life not like a savior but like a shadow, slowly consuming every part of her that had once belonged to herself. She told Emma about the order to sabotage her position with Dalton, about the lies she spun and the mask she wore even while pretending to be her friend. She even confessed to the latest ultimatum, the directive to eliminate Vaughn, a man whose only crime might be knowing too much. Emma stood motionless, her expression unreadable as Jocelyn unraveled before her. For a long, terrible moment, she said nothing. The silence roared louder than any accusation could. And Jocelyn waited for the inevitable recoil, for Emma to curse her, to walk away, to strip her down with words of righteous anger. But none of that came. Instead, something shifted in Emma's gaze. The steel melted just slightly, replaced by a flicker of understanding, hesitant, cautious, but unmistakably present. She didn't reach out, didn't offer comfort, but her eyes no longer looked at Jocelyn as an enemy. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but its clarity was absolute. Emma, too, had once been approached by WSB. She had received their carefully worded invitations, their strategic appeals to her sense of justice, to her family legacy, to her ambition. But unlike Jocelyn, she had hesitated. She had stared down the abyss and decided she wasn't ready to lose herself. She hadn't said yes. Not because she was morally superior, but because she had been afraid. Afraid that once she stepped into that world, there would be no way back. And hearing what Jocelyn had endured only confirmed those fears. But Emma didn't condemn her. On the contrary, she called Jocelyn's choice, however flawed, a form of courage. It took strength to act, to protect, to bear the burden of consequence while continuing forward. Betrayal, in this context, wasn't so easily defined. The world they were being drawn into didn't operate in black and white, and maybe it never had. What Brennan saw as loyalty was often a mask for manipulation. What the WSB called necessary sacrifice could feel indistinguishable from moral erosion. And in that painful, jarring truth, Emma and Jocelyn found each other, not as rivals, not as adversaries, but as survivors. The distance between them began to shrink, not physically, but emotionally. They were no longer just two university students navigating papers and internships. They were two souls who had been forced to grow up too fast, who bore invisible scars that no one else could see. They understood now that survival came with a price, that in order to preserve the small pieces of themselves that still felt real, they would have to lean on each other, even if that meant standing against the very system that had tried to pit them against one another. The storm that had raged so violently inside Jocelyn began to quiet, just slightly. Not because everything was forgiven or forgotten, but because she no longer carried the truth alone. Emma's presence didn't absolve her, but it anchored her. It reminded her that even in the most clandestine, corrupted corners of their world, connection was still possible. That trust, fragile, hard-won, and deeply imperfect, could still grow in the soil of betrayal. They didn't promise anything. No declarations of renewed friendship, no grand reconciliations. But when Emma finally said, "Thank you for telling me," it was enough. It was more than Jocelyn had expected. And as they stood together in that moment, exposed, wounded, but quietly defiant, they knew that something had changed. Not the past, and not the machinery of the organization that had ensnared them both, but something within themselves. Jocelyn no longer felt like she was drowning. And Emma, for the first time, didn't feel so alone. In the wreckage of lies and missions and impossible choices, they had found a small shard of truth, and it was enough to keep going. However, the fleeting sense of relief that had briefly settled between Jocelyn and Emma was shattered almost immediately by a new and calculated challenge orchestrated by Brennan. He summoned them both to a secure WSB facility, where the sterile lighting and silence felt more oppressive than any interrogation room. Standing behind a sleek, steel desk, he announced a new directive, one that felt less like a professional decision and more like psychological warfare. Only one of them, he stated with chilling detachment, would be selected as the official assistant to Professor Dalton. The other would be reassigned to an undisclosed unit. But what made the assignment ominous was not merely the reassignment itself, it was where that unit would be. It would be remote, under minimal oversight, with high exposure to volatile field operations and minimal extraction protocols. In essence, it was a death sentence disguised as an opportunity. The declaration hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. It wasn't simply a matter of career trajectory or preference. It was a deliberate attempt to drive a wedge between them, to force one of them to forsake principle for advancement. Brennan wasn't choosing the more qualified candidate, he was observing which of the two would break first, who would weaponize trust, who would abandon moral boundaries in order to win. It was a calculated test meant to unearth their limits, and ultimately, their humanity. Jocelyn didn't flinch. In her time under Brennan's shadow, she had come to anticipate these cruel manipulations. She recognized his pattern now, setting traps disguised as choices, cloaking brutality in strategy, and turning loyalty into a battlefield. But Emma was not as prepared. The disappointment on her face was stark, not because she feared losing, but because she realized how little her integrity meant to the man they were expected to obey. What hurt most wasn't the competition itself. It was that the system they were slowly becoming part of was built on dismantling trust, using friendship as leverage, and rewarding betrayal. They were no longer just young women trying to navigate a complex institution. They had become chess pieces on a board soaked in blood and secrets, expected to destroy one another in silence. But Jocelyn refused to play the game by Brennan's rules. She had crossed enough lines to know where her limits were, and while she wasn't sure she could ever reclaim the innocence she had lost, she knew she could still make choices that mattered. That still meant something. And so she made a bold decision, one that defied everything Brennan had built around her. Instead of executing the order to eliminate Vaughn, a man she once owed her life to, Jocelyn devised a plan to help him escape. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely unauthorized. She recruited a discreet network of field operatives still loyal to Vaughn's legacy, created a false trail suggesting he had been ambushed and killed during a transfer, and personally rerouted his extraction through an abandoned WSB communications node. Every piece of it had to work perfectly, or it would be her own downfall. But that wasn't enough. Jocelyn needed to ensure Brennan couldn't use Vaughn as a pawn again. So, she gathered fragments of evidence. Audio recordings, intercepted briefings, and mission reports that exposed inconsistencies in Vaughn's supposed betrayal. Her objective wasn't just to spare a life, but to remove the leverage Brennan thought he had. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for backup. For the first time, her actions were guided not by command but by conscience. And in that moment, whether she succeeded or failed became less important than the fact that she had reclaimed agency over her own soul. When Brennan found out, his fury was expected. He confronted her in the same cold facility where he had first issued the directive, the room now crackling with silent tension. But what surprised him, and perhaps disturbed him, was Jocelyn's unwavering composure. She didn't deny it. She didn't grovel or explain. She simply stood there, her eyes meeting his without fear, accepting whatever punishment was to come. She had defied him, yes. But she had also completed the mission. Just not in the way he had anticipated. Vaughn was gone. No trace. No data. No failure. Just absence. A quiet, perfect ghost in the system. And Brennan, after a long, silent assessment, did something unexpected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. Instead, he gave her the smallest of nods. A signal not of approval, but of recognition. Perhaps, in Jocelyn's rebellion, he had finally seen the kind of agent the WSB truly needed. Not a puppet to be pulled by invisible strings, but a force of will strong enough to challenge even the system that created her. She wasn't easy to manipulate anymore. She had seen the edge, and stepped back from it on her own terms. Emma, too, received her answer. She was not discarded or punished. Instead, she was offered a place beside Jocelyn, not as a competitor, but as a partner. The two of them, once pitted against each other in a carefully crafted crucible, were now bound by something deeper than assignment or status. They had walked through fire, seen each other at their worst, and come out not unscathed, but stronger. There was no promise of safety in what lay ahead. The world they now inhabited was still filled with traps, enemies, and impossible choices. But they understood something now. That in a place where truth was currency and loyalty was a liability, the only thing that might keep them grounded was each other. In the chaos that surrounded them, it wasn't titles or clearances or commendations that mattered most, it was trust. Fragile, imperfect trust. And truth. Even when it came too late. Even when it hurt. Even when it came wrapped in guilt and whispered through trembling lips. They had both chosen to remain human. And in that choice, they had reclaimed a piece of themselves the WSB had nearly stolen. Together, as official partners, they would face what came next. Whether it would be war, silence, or betrayal, they would face it with eyes open, and hearts, if not whole, then still beating in defiance of the system that tried to erase them.